How many voices do you get then? Quickly through this. Next-gen consoles depends really terribly much on the DSP. Somewhere between 60 and 512. Depends on CPU load as well, because since you're doing this in software, you might decide that you want to use the processor to run a game. Oh. On the PC, that's very much an issue. The software mixer will do 256 voices, but on a 3 GHz PC, that's going to take most of your CPU time. You might have a bit of trouble pitching that one to your lead programmer. Unless you're doing an audio-led game, it does happen. On the X-Fi, the limitation on the X-Fi is you've got about 400 filters in hardware, which sounds like a lot, but if you're doing occlusion on 4 different reverbs and you've also got a filter on your dry send, this means that if you're doing that, you're down to about 75 voices. Nonetheless, if you're only doing occlusion on some of those voices, you get more. 127 is the upper limit. It should be 128, but Microsoft have nabbed one before we get in there. And then, we're on again, I think. Yeah, on the Audigy is simpler hardware. You get between 60 and 63. Nonetheless, still a pretty practical value to aim at, and the sort of thing that a virtual voice system can cope with well. On the N-Force, it's OpenAL 1.0, slight differences, and around 40, 44 voices. Sound Blaster Live, that's a game we could support in cricket, we can't support in Rally really. It's about 30 voices. There's a Vista driver which will go straight to that. And there's also the Direct Sound 3D translation Pete mentioned. Oh, just before I go back into a demo, I'll talk briefly about the idea of groups. I'm sure you're all aware of volume groups in games, the idea that it's going to be possible and convenient to be able to adjust the volume of several things in a game simultaneously. Actually, groups are really useful in virtual voice management and generally in improving communication between programmers and designers as well, because groups allow decisions you'd normally have to make on a per voice basis to be made and tweaked collectively for related systems in the game as you're developing it, as you're moving it between platforms, and later on when it's running, when you're doing the dynamic mixing of the game. So a few things. The obvious thing, groups are good for managing banks of sounds that need to be loaded together to get decent performance off optical drives, fading, balancing, but also they're very good for capping. When I go back to that business of priorities, you might say, well, actually, it's really important that we have collisions, so they're all going to have to be important sounds. But after the first 10 or so, you know, people really aren't going to miss all of those other contact points. So we use a system based on the groups where there's a certain number of voices in a given group that can be considered important. And if you start to play any more voices than that in that given group, it automatically, dynamically drops the priority to optional. And that's a very effective way of making the game still sound good without ending up with a situation where one particular unusual event suddenly strangles the rest of the game audio. Also, crucially, groups good for tailoring the design to platform capabilities, because if you've split the design conceptually up into subsystems and you're told suddenly make it run on a Wii or make it run on a DS or something like that, it gives you a good start in terms of working out what you can drop and still have a coherent game design. It's good as well to use groups because you can then use those as a way of saying, on a given PC, you discover I've got one reverb. Well, in that case, with one reverb, when I'm on one camera view, say in-car, I'm going to use the reverb for all of the in-car stuff. When I'm outside the car, I'm going to use the one reverb for the environment, tunnels and things like that. If you've got 4 reverbs, then you would assign them differently. You'd maybe use one for in-car and an external one and a few for reflectors from the environment. So, groups allow you to reassign the DSP effects on a per-platform basis, dependent as well on variants of the platform or CPU load, things like what game mode you're in, whether on a split-screen multiplayer mode, and also what view you're looking at in the game.